so welcome everybody. Welcome to the webinar from Carbohydrates to Keto, Meal Planning for Diabetes. We hope that this is a useful session for you and that you gain some new tools and some new knowledge. My name is Wendy Gamblin and I'm one of the registered dietitians at the Hamilton Family Health Team. And we also have Kate Park with us, who's also helping to co-facilitate the webinar today. She's also a dietitian with the Hamilton Family Health Team. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the goal of today's webinar is to hopefully provide you with some information and tools to help you with your meal planning and making healthy food choices to help with managing your diabetes. We hope that you'll be able to get a better understanding of carbohydrates and how they impact blood sugar levels and diabetes care in general. Okay, next slide. Okay, so many people with diabetes, and especially those who are just new to diabetes, are quite often pretty overwhelmed with all the information available out there about dietary strategies. People often want to know how to eat with diabetes and what to avoid. They may be anxious or worried that they can no longer eat common foods. They're wanting information on how to plan healthy meals so that their blood sugar levels will stay well controlled. Setting goals is also a very important first step to make positive changes with managing diabetes. Okay, next slide. So food is medicine. I know we've heard that a lot, and it's quite true. So knowing what, when, and how much to eat can really make a big difference in your overall health. We know that keeping your blood sugar within good ranges will help to delay some of the long-term complications that often accompany diabetes. The risk of heart disease is increased in diabetes, so being able to manage not only blood sugar, but also blood pressure and cholesterol levels is very important. Following a healthy diet is a very big piece of the diabetes puzzle. Okay, next slide. Okay, so the fountain of truth. There's a lot of information and misinformation out there when it comes to knowing which foods to eat and which foods to avoid. Having good information is important, but unfortunately, not everything we hear or read about in regards to diabetes is true. So we're going to go through a few comments now and discuss whether some of these things that you may have heard are actually a myth or a truth. So starting out with one of them, the leading cause of diabetes is eating too much sugar. So what do you feel about that? Do you think that's a myth or a truth?
So if you want to respond, you should have the option, if you look at your individual screen, to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Yeah.
In the, let me see if I can find it here.
It's in the, or even type into the chat.
Yep, or feel free to type into the chat.
I'm actually seeing some responses here. So yeah, true. Or sorry, that's a myth. You're right. People are putting the thumbs down. So it's a myth, yes. Eating too much sugar will not give you diabetes. However, if you do have diabetes, eating too much sugar is not a great option to help keep your blood sugars under control. Okay, another comment that we sometimes hear. Type 2 diabetes is more common than type 1 diabetes. What do you think about that? Yeah, exactly. So that is a truth. We know that type 2 diabetes is the most prevalent type of diabetes in our culture. And it's usually around 80% of the population with diabetes have type 2. So yes, that's actually a truth. Okay, so next one. You will always be able to tell when you're having a low or a high blood sugar. What do you think? Do you think that's true or a myth? It's a bit of a mix, and I know that one can be a bit complicated, but it's actually a myth. You're not always able to tell if you're having a low or high blood sugar. Now, if you're testing your blood sugars, you'll know, you can see it physically, look at the number on the glucometer, but you may not feel it physically without testing. So that's why it's always good to, be able to test and kind of know where you're at with your blood sugars. Okay, so maybe we'll move on to the next slide, just in the sake of time. Okay, so myth or truth, here's another one. If I go a long time during the day without eating, what we also know as sort of titled or become intermittent fasting, that will improve my blood sugar. So what do we think about that? And again, I think we're seeing a bit of a mix here with responses. So going a long time without eating doesn't necessarily improve blood sugar control. We know that it can actually put you at risk of your blood sugars dropping if you go too long between meals. So ideally with diabetes, we want to make sure that you're eating consistently through the day to help keep your blood sugars consistent through the day. And meals generally should be spaced about 4 to 5 hours apart. Okay, next slide. So when we talk about intermittent fasting, and that again is, going long periods of time without eating, there are some pros and some cons to this. So what we know is that doing this we can sometimes see some weight changes, positive weight changes. And obviously it's easy to implement because you're not making meals, you're not eating meals, so you can just, fill that time with other activities. However, there's always cons to every choice that we make. And so when we do go long periods of time without eating, again, like I said, it does kind of put you at risk for blood sugars going a little bit low. Also, your brain likes carbs. Your brain kind of needs that fuel to get through the day. And so sometimes, you're not feeling so great when your blood sugars are running a little low. You're going too long between meals. You can get that sort of hangry feeling or feel a little bit edgy or anxious or just, not yourself. And also we know that when people tend to go too long through the day without eating, they tend to eat a little bit more later in the day, kind of just compensating, for not having that fuel through the day. So again, those are just some of the cons that can come with intermittent fasting.
So Wendy, I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt. We actually have a question from the audience. One person is asking, can fasting be good for you and how often would be considered safe? So I think this would be somebody that was using intermittent fasting for short periods of time and then taking breaks from it. Could that be considered safe is kind of the question.
Do you want to address that or do you want me to address it?
I mean, I'm happy to answer, but I feel like you kind of covered a lot of that in your pro-con section here.
Yeah, we kind of did.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The reality is in small bouts, you may see some of the benefits that Wendy spoke about. But then if you look at the con list here, there can be some longer term risks. And there are actually individuals where we would definitely not recommend intermittent fasting, particularly those that would be on blood sugar medications that can lead to hypoglycemia. So someone, for example, that's on insulin, this would be a very dangerous practice because if you're taking your insulin and not eating food, that would put you at increased risk. We definitely also wouldn't recommend intermittent fasting probably for older individuals. We do know that as we get older, the risk of for not being able to feel hypoglycemia or low blood sugar can increase. And so if you're going long stretches without eating and your blood sugar is going low and you don't have that sensitivity, there's risk that you could go to a deeper level of hypoglycemia. So, I mean, in healthy individuals, intermittent fasting may offer some benefits, but there's often a lot of cons that can come with it, and there needs to be a lot more monitoring to be able to do it in a safe manner.
I agree. And also during this particular time in our lives with COVID, and, there tends to be a bit more isolation, people on their own. And, like you said, with the elderly population, it may not be the best choice at this point in time. Also, just to remember with intermittent fasting, I would say, again, just sort of short periods of time if it's happening at all. It's not something that goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks, just because of the, the risks that can be associated with it. So, but good question. Very good question. Okay. Next slide. So again, we talked about low blood sugars or what we call hypoglycemia. And that's when blood sugars drop below 4. And these are some of the signs and symptoms that you would likely feel if you were having a hypoglycemic event. So you might feel a bit headachy or sweating. You might have some blurred vision, feel a little bit dizzy, definitely can be hungry, irritable, a bit anxious. You might feel like your heart's beating a little faster, or you might feel like fatigued and tired and weak. So just be aware and, kind of checking in with yourself, how you're doing, how you're feeling, and what might be contributing to those sensations. Okay, the next slide. So again, myth or truth? So since, this is the comment here, since my insulin is no longer working well, if I follow the keto diet and avoid eating carbohydrates that need insulin, I can control my diabetes. So again, we look at sort of balanced eating, and we know that with diabetes, it is important to get a balanced diet to be able to get all of the nutrients from all of the different food groups each day to help keep blood sugars more consistent through the day. So avoiding carbohydrates completely, or having very, very small amounts of carbohydrates doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily a fix to keeping blood sugars under control. Your body can work in different ways to break down other stores, to produce glucose for the bloodstream. So I tell people when you're following a keto type diet, it's sort of like if you're driving a car that takes regular gas and you put diesel in it by accident. Now your car will probably run, but it might not run very well. And same with the body. If it's not getting enough carbohydrates to do what it needs to do, you're still going to live, you're still going to function, but it's not optimal. So I would say that this is a myth. Okay. All right. Next slide. So the keto diet, the good, the bad, the ugly. And again, with every sort of particular eating style, there's pros and there's cons. So if we look at the good, again, we can see improvements with glycemic control over the short term. And there's also the potential for weight loss. So that's not always a bad thing. The bad, again, can just be the fact that there's not enough carbohydrates in the day for your body to function the way it likes to function normally, particularly with the brain. So that can have impacts on your mood, how you're feeling, feeling fatigued, you could be cranky again, a bit irritable. Also, because the carbohydrate restriction is so low, it puts you at risk for not being able to get some of the other nutrients your body may require. Such as calcium that comes from dairy, magnesium, potassium, iron, and other things like that. Missing fruits and dairies and grain servings through the day. Those are things that you might really enjoy. Again, missing out on some of the nutrients, the fiber, the vitamins, the minerals that come from those foods that you're not consuming. And also the heart health benefits of eating a fully balanced diet with the fiber and the other nutrients to help keep cholesterol levels in check. And then with the ugly, because the keto diet tends to be a higher fat diet, if the fats that are being consumed are what we call the bad fats, the more saturated fats, then that can be an increase for more cardiovascular risk, higher cholesterol, and concerns with a bit of insulin resistance because of those bad fats. So again, weighing the pros and the cons and looking at all of these options is always helpful. Okay.
So I'm just going to hop in here now for the next couple of slides. Thank you so much, Wendy.
Yeah.
And actually, talking about the keto diet and fats really leads well into just general healthy eating patterns, because we've talked a lot about some of the current trends when it comes to blood sugar control and diet. But the more wholesome approach to healthy eating would include a pattern that's rich in fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains. We know that these foods provide a lot of key nutrients to the body. They also offer lots of fiber. And then, of course, things like fish and olive oil offer some of those heart-healthy fats. And so we generally try to encourage incorporating all these foods foods, because the experience is that less restrictive eating patterns that emphasize these quality foods tend to be more sustainable, meaning they're easier to do long term. And that's really probably one of the key messages. Any sort of practice you're going to do around healthy eating needs to fit your lifestyle and be something that you can do long term. Styles of eating that, you know, are really challenging and very restrictive that you can only do for really short periods of time because maybe it makes you feel incredibly hungry, or it really limits your ability to eat with your families, things like that, are definitely not the sort of approaches we want to encourage long term because of both the health consequences and just the impact that it can have on your life. You know, it needs to fit you individually. So that's often why we're encouraging this more kind of open approach to eating. So including lots of nutritious foods from all the food groups. But we're going to really focus in on one of the key nutrients that tends to play a big role in our blood sugars, and that's carbohydrates, sometimes shortened down to the word carbs, right? And let's talk about where carbohydrates come from, because a lot of us think about carbohydrates coming from things like grains, but one key area is fruits. So fruits contain something called fructose, which is essentially fruit sugar. Now, a serving of carbs is roughly about 15 grams of carbs. And we're going to talk a little bit more about carb servings in a couple of minutes. But the natural sugar in fruits is a source of carbohydrates. And one of the questions that we often get in the office is, well, because there's sugar in fruit, do I need to avoid it? And the answer is no. Like, this can be absolutely a carbohydrate that we incorporate as part of the diet. Generally, we just encourage people to spread it out through the day, as well as be mindful of how much you're having per serving. So a general rule of thumb that we often recommend in practice is a serving of fruit for a lot of fruits is roughly about the size of your fist. This can vary depending on the fruit and how much sugar is in it. And a lot of the research actually shows that incorporating regular sources of whole fruits in the diet, so fresh or frozen, tends to actually have a positive effect on diabetes. The type of sources of fruit that tend to maybe have a negative effect would be those that come from processed sources, particularly things like fruit juices. And the reason we see this from things like fruit juices is, unlike whole fruit juices tend to have very concentrated sources of fruit sugar. It's very difficult to sit and eat 4 whole oranges. It's very easy to sit down and drink the juice from 4 oranges because it can be pressed down. There's really no fiber in there to kind of fill us up. And so you end up consuming way more fruit than you would if you ate the whole fruit. So yes, fruit can affect your blood sugar levels, but if we're incorporating whole fruit sources and spreading it out over the day, up to 3 servings a day can still be part of a healthy diet. Now, another common source of carbohydrates is from dairy. This is one that I often find people don't think of as a source of sugar, but your dairy is a source of lactose. So where fruit has fructose, dairy has lactose, also known as milk sugar. So these are carbohydrates. And again, a serving is approximately 15 grams. And all of the foods that you're seeing on the page are different sources. Now, the one food that generally in the dairy family that doesn't have a lot of carbohydrates would be cheese. In diabetes, we tend to move cheese more into the protein section. So don't think of that one as one that you would be looking to count carbs, but yogurts, milks, probiotic yogurts that contain like kefirs or probiotic yogurts contain carbohydrates, but they can also be a great source of protein and calcium, which is why we still encourage people to incorporate these more often in the diet. Sorry, I'm just seeing that there's another question. Yes, so Greek yogurt would also fall in the carbohydrates. The only difference would be that there's significantly more protein in Greek yogurt as opposed to traditional yogurts. And for some people, that will mean that it fills you up quicker. And keeps you full for longer. So sometimes you end up having a smaller portion. And it's also a great thing to add to, say, like a breakfast where maybe you don't get a lot of protein traditionally, but it does provide a little bit of carbohydrate. And then our next area, and this is the one that most of us, when we think, okay, what's a carb? These are the foods that often come up first, right? A lot of our grains and starches. So this includes things like breads, rice, pastas. Again, a carbohydrate serving is approximately 15 grams of carbs. The examples that you can see on the screen here are approximately 15 grams of carbs. So 10 French fries has the same amount of carbohydrate as half a cup of cooked rice or pasta. Emphasis on the cooked, because if you were to measure out half a cup of raw rice or pasta, what ends up happening is it will expand, and so you'll end up with closer to a full cup, which would actually be 2 carb servings. And an important thing within the grains, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later, you'll notice that one of the recommendations is to choose lower glycemic index grains. We're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail, a little bit further during the presentation today. But you can actually use that guideline I was recommending for fruits, also for your grains and starches, approximately the size of your fist. So if you're placing your hand next to your plate of pasta and you notice that the pasta is, say, 3 or 4 fist sizes, then you're probably looking at potentially 3 or higher servings of carbohydrates. So something to keep in mind when you're looking at those serving sizes. One other area we often get questions about is some of the sweeter vegetables. I know we talked about grains and things like that. We used to count things like carrots and red peppers as being part of our being foods that contain sugars, and we needed to count them towards our carbohydrates. What we've learned over the years is that you have to eat a rather significant amount of these foods to really move the dial on your blood sugars, upwards of a cup. And most of us traditionally would not eat upwards of a cup of, say, something like a red pepper or peas or carrots. For individuals that have really sensitive blood sugars or maybe monitoring and taking insulin, you may need to take these things into account depending on your blood sugar control. But for the average person, things like carrots, peas, and those sort of vegetables we don't count, except for 2. Does anyone have a guess what 2 vegetables would still count as having carbohydrates? If no one has a guess, I'll let you know. The 2, I always think of them as it's generally your corn and potatoes are the 2 that we're still going to count. And it's not that corn and potatoes are good or bad. It's just that compared to our other vegetables, they do have a significant amount of carbohydrates and starches in them. So we do still need to count those. And I would use, again, that same kind of rough guideline that I was using with the size of your fist as a serving of those vegetables. So rather than counting them as part of your non-starchy veggies, we want to put them in the same categories as our grains and pastas if we're having them as part of a meal. And we're going to talk a little bit about meal balance in just a second. So what foods won't affect your sugars? Well, one of those foods would be fats. Fats generally don't have any carbohydrates whatsoever. So things like olive oil, butter, canola oils are fatty foods. We generally don't count those towards our carbohydrates. So you don't want to be trying to carb count. You will notice if you look at the nutrition information on most of them, there's 0 carbohydrates. Meats also don't really affect our blood sugars, at least not in traditional amounts. Most meats are just primarily protein, unless they've been seasoned with something sweet, but generally we're not going to be carb counting those. Although, just as a bit of information, very large portions of protein can convert to sugar in the blood, but it has to be a very large amount. So I'll just give you a classic example. I've had individuals who are like, well, I'm going to avoid carbohydrates, so I'm going to have, a really large steak and my vegetables for dinner, and that won't affect my blood sugars. And you're right. Immediately after, when you would normally check your blood sugars, you're probably not going to see much of a movement on the dial. But what you might notice later on, 4 or 5 hours later, is your sugars suddenly start to rise, because that extra protein that your body wasn't able to digest because of the large amount that you ate eventually gets turned into sugar in the blood. So the body often, when it has anything in excess, a lot of times will try to convert that over into either storing it as fat or sugar. So just something to be aware if you have tried this approach. The reason you might still be seeing your sugars rise after just having meat and vegetables could be just the sheer portion size that you are having. So just something to keep in mind. And then of course things like our cheeses generally don't affect our readings. So generally your fats and your meats and cheeses don't really affect blood sugars. It's your fruits, it's traditional dairy products, your grains and starches, and then of course sweets, things like that. Most of our vegetables we're not going to count except for corn and potatoes. So now you have a sense of which foods fall in the carbohydrate section and which foods don't fall in the carbohydrate section. And carbs versus not carbs is not good or bad, but it's important when you're meal planning as someone with diabetes to know which foods are going to affect your blood sugar so you can plan balanced meals, which is what we're going to talk about next. So just as a review here, here's a picture of a dinner where we have chicken and broccoli and rice, some fruit on the side, and then milk. So the parts of this meal that are going to, in the portions that we have right now, really affect your blood sugars are going to be the strawberries, it's going to be the glass of milk, and it's going to be the rice, right? But the chicken and the broccoli is really not going to have much of an impact. And actually it's going to help to balance that meal and help to slow down those natural sugars that are in those foods that are indicated on the picture to help you gain better control. So we've talked a little bit about carbs and carb choices. So now the question is, okay, how much carbohydrates should I be having at a meal? Well, that's going to be a very individual thing. If you have a smaller appetite, 3 carbohydrate choices or approximately 45 grams of carbs per meal might be appropriate. If you're somebody with a moderate appetite, you might be looking at 4 carbohydrate choices per meal. And then if you have a larger appetite, you might go as high as 5. And part of this might depend on your activity level, your age, overall what you're intaking. So it can be very individual. But we often find for most meals, traditionally, people are eating somewhere between 3 to 5 carbohydrate choices per meal. And we should talk a little bit about what falls in each of those categories. Wendy, you're going to have to forgive me. I'm not sure which slide you're jumping in on here.
21.
Okay. Unfortunately, I can't see the numbers the way I'm set up.
Okay. So this is your last slide, and then I'll jump in.
Perfect. I knew it was coming up. I just wasn't sure. Thank you so much. So again, as I was saying with the carbohydrate choices, and we're going to talk about a tool you can use to kind of figure out how much carbs are in different foods and what a carb choice is, but I've given you those ranges. But one of the best tools for identifying how a food is affecting your blood is to use your glucometer. This is probably one of the best tools at your disposal to figure out your individual needs, because you'll notice there was a huge range in the amount of carbohydrate we were recommending. And so one way you can use your glucometer to assess how your body's handling a meal and the amount of carbohydrate you had is to test before that meal and test 2 hours after that meal. Now, traditionally, we're aiming for a sugar before a meal between 4 and 7. And 2 hours after a meal, we're aiming for it to be between 5 and 10. You know, if you have really poor blood sugar control, we may encourage more trying to get between 5 and 8 2 hours after a meal. But again, that's something to talk about with your healthcare team or your registered dietitian to figure out what's going to be the best fit. But anyways, looking at that before and after, if your reading before your meal and 2 hours after your meal only goes up by about 1 to 2 points and stays well under 10, then you actually handled the amount of carbohydrate in that meal really well. So that can be a way you can use your machine as a tool. And I wouldn't encourage people to do this every day, every week, every month. But if you've never tried this before, a really great exercise is to try testing your sugars before and after every meal for about 2 days. A lot of the dietitians at the family health team have a 2-day glucose log they can give you that you can use for doing this. And then you record what you eat at each of those meals. And then the meals where you see those sugars going up more than those 2 points or well above 10, that's an opportunity to investigate that meal and maybe figure out what it was about that meal that didn't work. Was it the amount of carbohydrates? Was it the balance of the meal? Was it that it was a low glycemic index? And we're going to talk about some of those factors on the next couple slides. But this is a really great exercise to try, and any dietitian of the family health team would be happy to support you in trying to do this analysis. So definitely worth giving a try.
Okay, that's great, Kate. Thanks for all that helpful, really useful information. So we've talked about different carbohydrates and we've talked about different amounts. So, how much is an appropriate amount of carbohydrates for each day? So it's important to remember that the amount of carbohydrates we need can actually vary by individual, but they also can vary within each individual. There could be days when you feel that you need to eat a little bit more and days when you feel you need to eat a little bit less. So these things are not necessarily carved in stone. And as Kate was saying, sometimes it's good just to experiment and see. So, okay, I'm really, really feeling hungry today. I'm eating a few more carbs. What's actually happening to my blood sugar when I eat this way versus the days where I just don't have as much of an appetite? So again, just being curious and checking in and finding out how your different carbohydrate level does impact your own blood sugar levels. So we look and we see on the slide here, there's sort of 3 different categories. So there's a very low carbohydrate range, which is 20 to 50 grams of carbs, which would be very similar to the keto diet. And we have a lower carbohydrate diet, which is less than 130 grams per day. And then there's the moderate to high carbohydrate, which is roughly 165 to 180 or greater grams of carbs per day, which would be similar to sort of the Canada's Food Guide or the Diabetes Food Guide, which we're going to go through in just a minute, as well as the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet. So some of you may have heard about the Mediterranean diet, and Kate did speak a little bit about it as far as the balance with getting the healthy fats and the nuts and the seeds and the fruits and the vegetables and the whole grains. So both the Mediterranean diet and the DASH diet have very good research behind them for being heart healthy diets. And as we know, with diabetes, there is an increased risk of heart disease. So these are particularly healthy sort of patterns to follow as far as overall eating each day. Okay, next slide. So I talked about the Diabetes Food Guide. And so here this is just another tool that can be used again for meal planning. And basically what it does is it divides up the foods based on whether they do or do not contain carbohydrates. And then it gives us the amount of carbohydrates in some common foods. Now I know this slide is pretty small, so it's not as easy to see sort of all of the written details. Again, your dietitian can provide you with one in your doctor's office. So sort of the recommendation with this is based on a balanced diet. So it would include like 6 grain choices in a day, equally spaced out through the day. So there's a couple grain choices at each meal. 3 fruits through the day, again, spaced out sort of equally through the day. Might be one with breakfast, one with lunch, one as a snack, one in the evening, sort of thing like that. And also including the milk and the dairy, the milk alternatives in the dairy group, again, for getting those sources of calcium that our body requires. So with this pattern of eating, what we see is it ends up being roughly between 11 and 12 grams of carbs each day, not each meal. So important to remember the difference between that, which works out to roughly, again, 165 to 180 grams of carbs per day. So that's just another tool that you can use for doing your meal planning. And if we go to the next slide, we can see the front side of the Diabetes Food Guide. Now this is sort of modeled on our old Canada's Food Guide where everything was put into a rainbow. So if we look at those middle groups, the brown group, which is the grains and starches, the orange colored group, which is the fruits, and then the blue group, which is the milk and the milk alternatives. Those are the groups that actually contain carbohydrates. So those are the foods that actually will break down in your body to become glucose. So just being aware of that is important when you're doing your meal planning. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what about snacks? We talked about eating consistently through the day and spacing meals sort of 4 to 5 hours apart. But what about snacking? Do we even need to snack? And snacking may be necessary. If your meal is going to be a little bit delayed, maybe a little longer than that 4 to 5 hours, absolutely a snack can be helpful. Again, listening to your own cues of hunger and fullness. If you're feeling like you just need something, maybe your last meal wasn't quite enough, or you've just been a little bit extra active, um, or people that generally are fairly active may find that they do need to snack a little more regularly. So this is just a list of, some healthy snacks. Each of these things contains roughly about 15 grams of carbohydrates. And again, just being aware, we don't want to have a snack that's quite high in carbohydrates because, again, that might just throw off our control and impact our overall blood sugar control if we're having too many snacks with too high amounts of carbohydrates. So there is room for snacking. Again, it's very individual, and it may vary on the day too, not just within each person. Okay, next slide. Okay, so we look at this meal here, comparing the carbohydrate content of these two meals. So on the left, we have a meal that has roughly 3 carbohydrate choices, so about 45 grams of carbs per meal. And on the right, we have, a hamburger and fries. It's actually a breaded chicken burger with some fries, which has, a higher amount, 5 to 6 carbohydrate choices. So it's important to sort of note, what a serving is. So we know that 10 French fries is the equivalent to about 1 slice of bread or 15 grams of carbohydrates. However, a usual order of French fries is not usually 10. It can be closer to 3 or 4, the equivalent of 3 or 4 slices of bread. And then when you have the bun, as well as the breading on the chicken burger, without even realizing it, it can be a quite high carbohydrate meal. Now, not saying that it's good or bad or indifferent, it's just being aware and being able to understand, what a meal looks like and how many grams of carbohydrates might be in that meal. And for people that are using insulin to manage their diabetes, this becomes even more important because quite often they have to dose the amount of insulin that they're using based on the amount of carbohydrates that they're consuming. So just being aware, what does a 3-4 carb meal look like versus a 5-6 carb choice meal look like? Okay, next slide. Okay, so when we look at meal planning, again, we want to make sure that we're getting that balance, getting all of the nutrients our body acquires, getting, a good variety of fruits and vegetables and grains and proteins. So this is another tool that can be used. This actual plate model comes from the Canada's Food Guide. So you may have seen this. You may have not, but what it shows is the plate being divided into sections. So it's another easy way when you're planning meals to just sort of pre-plan, okay, what is going to be my protein choice? What is going to be my carb choice? And then the half of the rest of the plate comes from veggies and fruit. So when we look at the protein choices, again, it's important to consider not only meat proteins, but maybe some plant-based proteins. And we look at the carbohydrate choice, again, we want to be focusing on those whole grains, the higher fiber choices, a little bit more regularly. Those types of carbohydrates tend to digest a little bit slower. They break down as sugar into the bloodstream at a slower rate and don't cause such a high spike in blood sugars after a meal. Again, it kind of leads into the glycemic index, which we'll be talking about in just a minute. I know we keep saying we're going to be talking about it, but we really are going to be talking about it. So again, this is just a helpful tool, especially when you're eating out to, to visualize how your plate looks. So sort of cutting your plate in half visually and filling that part of the plate with the vegetables, and then the other half sort of divided equally amongst your protein choice and your carbohydrate choice. And again, remembering water. We haven't been talking about water, but water should, for the most part, especially during these days with this type of weather, being your beverage of choice. So drinking enough water through the day is always important. Excuse me. Okay, next slide. So again, this is another tool that's available. Again, what it's showing here is a 3 to 4 carbohydrate choice meal. And so what that means is you're roughly getting, in this meal, 1 to 2 servings from the grain choice. So that would be things like, your breads, your starchy carbs, your breads and your potato and your corn, those starchy carbs, any baked goods, so breads, tortillas, crackers, English muffins, that sort of stuff. and those starchy carb type deal. And then it includes a fruit and a dairy serving with each meal. So with those grain choices and the fruit and the dairy adding up to becoming 3 to 4 carb choices per meal, or 45 to 60 gram carbohydrates at that meal. And then if we look at the next slide, it shows us a larger, yeah, thanks, Kate, a larger carbohydrate meal for people with maybe a bigger appetite. Oh, went too far. Perfect. Yeah. So this again shows us a meal for people maybe with a bigger appetite, people that are maybe a little bit more active. And so this has 2 to 3 servings from the grain and starches group per meal. Again, the 1 fruit and the 1 milk. Okay, so just kind of gives you an idea of what that might look like to get the 60 to 75 grams of carbs at that meal. And, you know, some meals, you know, the lunch may be a 3 carb choice and the supper may be a 4 to 5 carb choice. Again, there's no right, there's no wrong. It's really based on your own individual management of diabetes. And again, using that glucometer to see at the end of the meal, what's going on? How is my body handling this amount of carbohydrates? Okay. So here we are, the glycemic index we've talked about. So the glycemic index is basically sort of a ranking system or a rating system. And what it set out to do is it rates different types of carbohydrates on how quickly and how much they raise your blood sugar after consuming them. And so what you want to be sort of being mindful of is focusing on foods that have a lower glycemic index. And what that means is they don't raise the blood sugars as quickly or as high after consuming that food. So if we go to the next slide, it does kind of, and again, this might be difficult to see, but it does go through some particular foods and rates them. I'm just going to make my screen full here. Sorry, it rates them as whether it's a low, a medium, or a high glycemic index. So you can see from that chart there, some of the foods that are lower glycemic index, medium, and high. And it doesn't mean that you can never eat the high glycemic index foods. It just means that you want to eat them less often. And again, be curious. See what happens after you've had something from that higher glycemic index, what's happening to your own individual blood sugar after consuming it. Now, the thing that we need to know about this ranking system is that the way it's devised is based on eating an individual food on its own with nothing else. So, for example, having a piece of whole grain bread on its own and not eating anything else. And so we don't typically in our culture eat that way. We eat a piece of bread with maybe as part of a sandwich, or we put some peanut butter on it, or maybe there's an egg with it. So we tend to eat combined foods a bit more regularly rather than individual separate foods. So, so again, this is a helpful tool. I wouldn't say it's the be all and end all. The key kind of message from this is that you'll notice that the lower glycemic index foods also tend to be those higher fiber foods as well. So just using it as part of a tool for your meal planning is always a great choice, referring to it and just being curious. Okay, are those cornflakes low, medium, or high glycemic index? Where do they fit in there? And how often should I be having white rice? Maybe I should be doing brown rice a little bit more regularly. Okay, so again, just another useful tool for meal planning.
Mm-hmm. And Wendy, you're so right about like that it's very standalone, all the what they're indicating on here. And there's lots of other things that can influence the glycemic index as well. For example, how something's prepared. Mm-hmm. So I know it's hard to see on the screen, but if you notice, potato is actually in multiple categories depending on how it's prepared. So for example, red and white potato when it's hot tends to be high glycemic index, but when it's cooled, like in a potato salad, it tends to be a little bit lower. So there are little nuances to this, and you can actually get this glycemic index off of diabetes.ca, the Diabetes Canada website. It is accessible there. And of course, the dietitians at the office also have it readily available. But I mean, I wouldn't explicitly say, you know, always avoid everything in the high. Sometimes it's a matter of, you know, reducing that one or having it in combination with other foods. And I think it's also very important to emphasize the glycemic index is not about amount of carbohydrate, but rather the type, right? That these foods tend to break down at different rates into your bloodstream, because I know a lot of people are often always surprised to see that pasta is in the low category. Often that one is one that's associated with being high glycemic index. And the reason people often get into trouble with pasta is not because that it's high glycemic index, it turns into sugar quickly, it's often portions. Remember what I said earlier in the presentation, that a serving of grains or pasta is roughly the size of your fist. A lot of people may have 4 or 5 fist size of cooked pasta. And so even though it's entering the bloodstream slower than, say, sticky rice, it's all going to get into your bloodstream eventually. And that's why you may find that you still have those higher blood sugars. So a great tool, but it needs to be understood. And I mean, it's a great one to go over with your healthcare team to learn how to use it effectively. All right. So thank you so much, Wendy, for all of that information on the plates. And just to kind of as a practical application for how to use the glycemic index, let's just do a little quick comparison here. Remember what Wendy said, that we can't look at these foods in isolation, but we do know, say, if we were to compare a peanut butter and jelly sandwich on white bread compared to whole grain bread, as shown between the two on the left, these are foods that the whole grain one is likely going to raise our blood sugars more slowly. We've also incorporated some fruits and veggies on the side. And we do know that adding additional fruits and vegetables, the fiber content of those foods can also slow down sugar. So those are also going to contribute to slowing down our sugars between those two. Same thing when we're looking at, just say you had a plate of buttered noodles versus having those noodles along with some 2 different types of vegetables and some chicken, like in the second photo on the right. That is going to result in a lower blood sugar because, one, we're having a smaller portion, but also we have all that protein and fiber from those other foods to help balance it out. So we talk a lot about what carbohydrates are, and it's important to try and choose good quality carbs, but it's also important, and when we're eating them with other foods, to make sure we're eating them as part of balanced meals, which is why that plate is so helpful, because it helps us to automatically balance those foods that raise our blood sugars with the ones that often don't. Another thing that we can add to our meals that can also help with our blood sugars, besides those proteins from meats and fiber from vegetables, is healthy fats. So fat can serve a couple of purposes. First of all, fat adds a lot of taste, so it can make a meal much more enjoyable. And a lot of us have kind of shied away from using fats out of fear for the effect that it can have on our heart health. But there are very healthy fats that can be helpful to our heart, such as olive oil, avocado, nuts and seeds. And when we add those foods to our meals, what they do is they slow down gastric emptying, meaning the food sits in the stomach for longer. And that's great because it means it's not getting rapidly absorbed, right? So it's slowing down that absorption, which means you're going to have a better post-meal glucose, meaning your sugar, instead of going kind of quickly peaking and then dying off, you're going to get this more gradual rise. So you're not going to see that really high post-meal blood sugar. So if you're finding that, you're eating, your meats and vegetables and your carbohydrates, and you're still finding your sugars are going high, but you tend to avoid adding things like fats into your meals, try adding them in and see if you get a different result. Perhaps is that you've cut out too much fat from your meal, and this is one other way that you can help get better results from your blood sugars. And as I mentioned before, those heart-healthy fats from things like olive oil, nuts, and seeds will also help to boost your healthy cholesterol, which will improve your heart health. So what else can you do beyond the food? We've talked a lot about meal balance. We've talked about the glycemic index, all these great tools you can use. But there's other things outside of food that can make a really good improvement in your blood sugars after your meals. For example, avoiding sitting after a meal, going for a walk, tidying up the kitchen, doing tasks around the house, just keeping your circulation going and moving around helps you, one, to digest the food better, but also prevents, because what can happen if we sit for long periods of time is our body's insulin sensitivity can get worse. And so we actually have a harder time digesting sugar. So just getting up and moving can sometimes help us to use some of that blood sugar, but also help our body to use it more effectively. So we do know that long periods of sitting have been connected to worsening health, particularly around circulation and insulin resistance. So, and I find it's particularly challenging in times like these where, you know, limited options for where we can go and what we can do, but even just going for a walk around the block or doing things in your garden can have a positive effect on your blood sugar. So be sure to incorporate activity in whatever way you're able to. So let's actually look at a specific case. So we have Samantha here, who was recently diagnosed with type 2 diabetes and has been doing more cooking at home lately due to COVID-19. And one of her family's favorite dishes is chicken and rice, and she eats her usual serving and she tests her sugars, and they went up from 6.4 and after eating to 10.4 2 hours after. So knowing that the dish is chicken and rice, what are some reasons that you think that her sugars may have gone up? If anyone has thoughts, please feel free to add them into the chat. Serving size, yes, serving size could definitely play a role here, right? We did talk about how, and I mean, even if it had, say, been like a low glycemic index rice, if the portion was very large, there's a chance that that sugar just may have been too much for that person, and so that's why the sugar may have been high. Now, is this sugar reading after the meal within target for after the meal? Does anyone remember what that range is supposed to be 2 hours after a meal?
We might have to remind people, Kate.
So before meals, typically sugar should be between 4 and 7, and 2 hours after meals, we're aiming for the sugar to be typically between 5 and 10. So how did Samantha do? I would say in this case, we're probably looking at it's slightly out of target. Not to mention, if you remember, we talked about looking at the before and after, right? So if you notice, we went from 6.4 to 10.4. That is a 4-point increase, right? So that's a pretty significant rise. Typically before and after, we're hoping that it's only going to rise about 1 to 2 points. So now the question is, what could Samantha have done differently to improve her blood sugar readings after the meal? Well, let's think about some of the things we've talked about today. We've talked about how we could look at balancing that meal. We could go back to the plate. Maybe it's incorporating more vegetables. Maybe it's incorporating some healthy fats. Maybe it's looking at the portion size. Maybe it's looking for a lower glycemic index rice. Maybe it's going for a walk after the meal. There's lots of different things that we could do. There's no one answer to improving the sugar reading, which is why it's so individual. But I want you all to think about these things the next time you notice a significant rise in your blood sugar. Try doing those different things to your meals, or try adding that activity and see if you get a better result next time. Really, that's the benefit of having that glucometer at home, is to help you to make personal adjustments to better decrease those rise so that you get a better average blood sugar reading on your next blood test at the doctor's office. And that's actually about it for us today. So we hope that you understand better what, when, and how much to eat, and in order to help improve your blood sugars and protect your heart health, and that you can better identify those foods that contain carbohydrates and how to choose low glycemic index carbohydrates. Again, if you have any further questions about these things, your healthcare team would be happy to go over them. Some of the tools, I know they were a little bit small, but we can also, they're accessible through the family health team as well. We also hope that you have a better understanding of how to use your glucometer and do testing to better understand the impact of food on your blood sugars. and that you feel a little bit more confident planning healthy, balanced meals to meet your personal needs. And at the end of these sessions, we always like to talk about just setting a few small goals. We've given you all this great information. We don't expect you all to go out there and organize perfect carbohydrate balanced meals, but just maybe based on the information we've given you, set a couple of small goals. And these are just a few sample ideas we've set up here for you. So maybe you will plan to use the plate planner tool that we showed you today to portion your lunches and dinners meals for this week. It's kind of a fill in the blank meal plan. You could also look at going for a 20-minute walk after dinner at least twice a week if you know you tend to have higher blood sugars in the evening. Or maybe you're looking to measure your blood sugars before and 2 hours after a meal for a couple of days and then meet with your dietitian to analyze where your personal challenges are. Or maybe you've got a totally different goal you want to set, but even a small step towards better blood sugar control can make a big difference. So we encourage you to set 1 or 2 goals for yourselves today to kind of get onto that path. And if you want more help managing your diabetes, we do have a number of resources available. First of all, you can contact your diabetes team if you are at a DEC or if you have a team that you're working with through your doctor's office. Definitely, I would encourage you to book an appointment with your dietitian at your family's doctor's office, as they can go into more personal detail about all this information we've shared with you today. And of course, if you do have specific questions, you can actually email questions to the dietitians of the Hamilton Family Health Team through our website at hamiltonfht.ca. And if you're looking for more great information on improving your diabetes, diabetes.ca is a wonderful website, as well as unlockfood.ca has lots of great tips on healthy eating. So we would definitely encourage you to check those out. And we actually have this new fabulous online diabetes group. It's 2 weeks, 1 day a week for 2 weeks. We're offering it every month, and it's a great review of everything from prevention to nutrition to exercise. So if you really want to delve into this deeper, I would highly recommend checking out that class. You can access it through our workshop section on the website at hamiltonfht.ca. Just click on groups and workshops under nutrition groups, and you can actually register yourself. Feel free to use the email address or phone number that's available there. People would be happy to set you up and let you know when the classes are available. As I said, we're offering them monthly, so hopefully there will be time that works for you. We also have a number of other classes coming up. We do have some webinars on staying heart healthy at home during COVID-19. There is a food and mood and depression webinar coming up. We also have one on dealing with emotional eating, as well as we have a number of other groups, lifestyle groups like Healthy You, and we even have live stream cooking classes that are available. So there's lots of tools and resources available, again, all through the Family Health Team website. Please be sure to check it out. Your registered dietitian can also help you navigate if there's specific ones you're interested in, but all the details are on hamiltonfht.ca. We do have some other sessions that are being offered by our mental health counselors on stress management, how to reduce anxiety, dealing with grief, and substance use that are also available on the same website. So be sure to check those out as well. And now we want to leave a few minutes for any specific questions you have. So feel free to use the chat, or there is the Q&A button. Feel free to put your question in there, whatever's easiest. But we want to answer any specific questions that you might have now. Well, thank you very much, Faye. We really appreciate that.
Okay, so I don't see any questions. So maybe people had to run. I know it's through their lunch hour, so maybe they're heading off to grab a quick bite before they head back to work. So.
Well, thank you for everyone for watching.
Yes,
and if you have any further questions, feel free to email the dietitians through the website as well. We're always available to reach out to that way. So thank you, everyone, and have a great day.